So the world came. We heard from them. Thank you, everybody. Danny Blanchard again. Well, a great pleasure to have another wonderful session. And leading off, well, I'm going to backward order. We're going to end up with my colleague and co-author, Alex Bryson, and Maurizio Pugno, who I like a lot because he's kind of solved the causation problem. And then Gene, we know, who just told me, Danny, I know you're a fighter, I am too, so that's good. But the one we're going to start off with, I'm so pleased. I started this thing off and I thought, at the very beginning, I said, Putnam. Putnam, he's the man. So he's the man.
Great.
Told you 30 seconds, didn't I?
Yeah.
Can you hear me if I speak? You hear me? Okay. I'm Bob Putnam, and I'm going to speak for more than my equal share of this time, because I'm going to try to set a larger framework within which these three excellent experts are going to speak, but also I'm going to try to a little bit put a frame around the whole conference so you can see where this panel fits into the other panels that we have already heard or will hear next. Can we have the next slide, please? Basically, there are two types of explanation for the crisis in youth well-being. And I think we all agree, and I agree with the earlier speakers throughout this conference, that that's a real thing that we need to explain and then figure out what to do about. And first of all, there are a lot of individual level explanations, and we've heard a lot about the individual explanations, which include things like media usage and parental behavior and so on. That is, in which we're trying to explain how youth well-being is affected by the behavior of individuals. And I would say most of the conference is focused at that level, but some of it, including this panel, are focused at a different level of explanation that is looking at the broader social and historical context within which individual actors are making their decisions. And the contribution of this panel, and especially of my introduction, which is, I'm afraid, going to be longer than some of the others, has to do with changes in social isolation, which I'm going to shorthand by saying the phenomenon of bowling alone. And if you don't know what I mean by bowling alone, I'm going to explain a little bit later, but it's basically the idea that once upon a time we engaged in all sorts of activities, including athletic activities, including bowling, as members of teams in leagues, but that began to stop. Bowling is still big in America. Some people think that nobody bowls anymore. That's not true. More people in America bowl than vote. So, yeah, exactly. It's a big deal. But the number of people who take part in bowling leagues or are members of bowling teams has declined by roughly 95% over the last now half century. And that's what bowling alone is about. It's about a lot of things, but that's the core idea, that we've become in many ways disengaged from social connections. If we have the next slide, there are also two types of consequences of social connection or disconnection. One are the individual level effects. That is, if you're disconnected, there are consequences for you of that lack of social connection. Part of them is health, and I don't just mean youth mental health. Take, for example, your chances of dying. Actually, your chances of dying are high. Your chances of... And if not, see me afterwards. I'd like to know your secret. But your chances of dying over the next year are cut in half by joining one group. Cut in 3/4 by joining two groups. It's a huge effect on life expectancy, all-cause life expectancy. There are also individual effects on your personal prosperity. If you have better connections, both in the sense of social connections and in the sense of your blot, as that's the Russian term, I think, you'll do better in life. But there are also collective level consequences of the decline in social connection in America. And I would say the jury is still out about whether this long-run trend toward social isolation is true everywhere in the world. I don't claim that every place in the world has increasing social isolation, but it's true by now it's been shown to be true in most of Western Europe, certainly the United States. And so I'm going to focus my remarks on the circumstances in which there is long-run decline in social capital or social connection, and that shows up in aggregate level phenomena like the crime rate or democracy. And in fact, I originally began this whole journey that's now taken me about 40 years, exploring the consequences of social capital, by trying to understand what makes democracy work. Can we have the next slide? I'm going to begin, and I apologize for the fact that because I'm a political scientist and my journey has mostly been focused on the aggregate effects of aggregate changes in social connection, that is, the increasing bowling alone phenomena in America. I'm going to focus, probably for most of you, much too much time on American politics right now. I mean, today. How many of you actually follow a little bit of American politics? Do you recognize the name Trump, for example? Raise your hand if you recognize. Okay. Well, I'm going to begin right there. We elected a president just about a year ago now, in 2024. He called it a landslide that would change America. It may change America, but it was not a landslide. It was actually one of the narrowest, closest elections in American history. But it was a major signpost historically. And I want to illustrate that by quoting a guy named Steve Bannon. Now, this is a real test. How many of you have heard the name Steve Bannon? Oh, you have? Okay. Well, he's Trump's guru. And Steve Bannon said a couple of months ago, as recently as a couple of months ago, when somebody asked him, well, where did they get the idea for their campaign? He said back in the day, around 2017, when he and Trump were trying to figure out how would they get him elected, Bannon, read a strange book by a crazy Harvard professor named Bob Putnam. He read Bowling Alone, and Bannon said, all these people are socially isolated in America. Where they are socially isolated, they will be vulnerable to or open to authoritarian populist appeals. That's a true fact. It's a true fact that they are. And so, in some sense, I apologize for having brought you all Trump. It's actually empirically true. I mean, forget about what Bannon thought. It turns out that the best individual level predictor or aggregate level predictor of Trump's electoral support, best by far, is whether people are socially isolated or not. So it is true that low social capital, social isolation, has brought us Trump. And the main thing I want to say is that means that trend toward social isolation is not being fixed by Trump. It's actually getting worse. The most recent data say people are even more isolated now than they were, well, much more isolated now than they were when I wrote Bowling Alone, but even probably more isolated than they were 3 or 4 years ago. And Trump didn't cause that. This is a really important. Trump did not cause this problem, and he's not the real danger. The real danger is that the problem which caused Trump is getting worse. And until we fix that problem, or the problem of social isolation, and relatedly, a problem of a class gap, which I'm going to show you briefly about, until we fix those underlying problems, we're going to keep getting Trumps. And other places in the world that suffer from increasing social isolation will also suffer increasing likelihoods of authoritarian populism. And if this were a longer lecture and I had a lot more time, I'd go on to say this idea that socially isolated people are particularly prone to attractions to strong leaders. Uomo di polso is the Italian expression, a person of force, a strong leader. That idea goes back to the 1930s, and therefore it has deep roots in social theory. But I won't go there unless somebody wants to ask about that in the question and answer. And I'm going to try to leave enough time. We're going to try to leave enough time for some Q&A. Okay, let's have the next slide. Now, here's some empirical data about the United States. It's mostly drawn from a book that I co-wrote with a woman named Shailene Romney Garrett. If this were a lay audience and not a bunch of specialists, I would spend a lot of time on the next several slides, which show a lot of data, and you'd wonder, well, where did the data come from, and so on. But I don't have time for that, so I'm going to show you the slides. If you're a data person, your time has come. And if you're not a data person, that's all right. Just close your eyes, settle back. You can doze a little bit. If Putnam says anything interesting, your neighbor will nudge you to keep you awake. And so just trust me. That's a contrary behavior nowadays. That's an unusual behavior nowadays, but just for now, trust me. And I'm going to show you about long-term trends in 4 variables in the United States: political polarization, economic inequality, social isolation, or social capital, and cultural self-centeredness. And the question here is, we're in a pickle. That's a technical term, meaning that we're all Americans, all of us, whatever our political persuasions, recognize that America's not doing well. And therefore, my question is, how did we get here? So let's have the next slide. So here's you're going to see a number, 3 or 4, probably 5 graphs that look like this. And so I'll explain briefly. Let's see if I don't want to turn around too far because I'll fall off the stage. The horizontal axis that you see here is time. So behind me is 1890, the end of the 19th century. And over at the far end is, well, the data is mostly going to stop in 2015 because that's when we published the book. But in every case, you'll just have to trust me, the line is continued down, and in many cases is below. Now the data point is actually even below the lower axis of the graph. So, and they all have the same shape, so that's what that means. When you look from here to here, you're watching America change. Do you understand that? And the vertical axis is, in this case, a measure of political comedy, the opposite of polarization. Polarization is down in this case. So if you look at the graph, you see at the end of the 19th century, American politics were very tribal. There was virtually no cross-party collaborations between the party that was then Democratic and the party that was then Republican. The party's identities and compositions have changed somewhat, but there was no question that was a very polarized period. And now, let's run American history from the end of the 19th century to the beginning of the 21st century. Okay, that's what we're going to do is we just look this, go horizontally across this graph, and you can see that in the early years, the first decade of the 20th century, from 1900 to 1910, although we were very polarized in any absolute way, we were becoming slightly less polarized. There was a slight increase in cross-party collaboration, and that trend continues upwards. There's a little bit of a pause in the 20s, but just a little bit of a dip, but then it keeps going up and up and up. And by the middle 1950s, notice that it was going up to and through and after World War II. So this is not just a function of wartime solidarity, and that all the graphs will show the same thing. We're not just seeing the momentary effects of U.S. wartime solidarity, although there's a little bit of that in the data, but it's a longer-term trend. It goes up to the middle 1950s. The American president in the middle 1950s, almost none of you will have heard of him. He was a man named Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower was actually raise your hand if you've ever heard of Dwight Eisenhower. Whoa, what a literate group. Eisenhower was, everybody agrees, all historians agree, the least partisan president in American history except for George Washington. He could easily have been nominated by either the Democrats or the Republicans. He was a very moderate, middle-of-the-road person. And it's not that he caused this to be a pretty nonpartisan period. He was the result of it being a pretty nonpartisan period. And as you see, American politics continued to be pretty bipartisan during the 50s, into the 60s, pretty much into the 70s, but then it begins to change. For the first time in 70 years, then we're suddenly becoming slightly more partisan. And so it goes, and goes, and goes, and goes. So that you can see that basically from 1970, at least for the next half century, We have increasing polarization. And you want to know quickly, how did I measure polarization? In 7 different ways. That is, polarization at the level of the political elites, polarization at the level of ordinary Americans, changes in the structure of American elections, and so on. If you want to know in detail how we measured polarization, buy the book. No, I mean B-U-Y, the book. And I'm not going to, this is why I'm trying to save a little time. I'm not going to go through the details. But turns out it doesn't matter. All the graphs show the same thing. And as it happens, you can see Bob Putnam in this picture because I graduated from high school in 1959. So you can see what was America like when I was growing up. And it was extremely bipartisan. And every kid in town, every kid in my high school, a tiny little town in Ohio called Port Clinton, every kid knew the religion of every other kid in town. And why was that is because there was nobody ever married across religious lines. But nobody knew the politics, but who cared about the Democratic or Republican politics of those people? You weren't going to make your marital choices on that basis. It turns out that's completely changed now. Nobody cares, among young people now, nobody cares about, and among their parents, nobody cares whether you're marrying a Sikh or a Jew or whatever. It doesn't matter anymore. But everybody cares. The data are unbelievable. Used to be that back in the beginning when people ask, a national survey in America asked, how do you feel about your child marrying someone of a different marrying a Republican or a Democrat? The biggest single response, 95% of Americans laughed. That is, who would care? But 80% of Americans cared about the religion of their in-laws. And those figures are now reversed. Nobody cares about the religion. I'm trying to say these are big changes. These are not just minor little changes. Okay, so that's the long-run trend in political polarization. I'm now going to go more quickly because you see how the graphs work. Let's have the next graph. I think it's economics. This graph actually begins, because the hardest data begin in 1914. That's when the Internal Revenue Service is created, and then therefore we begin to have really, really good data. But we have pretty good data before that. And what this graph, if I showed you all the data, it begins very low. America at the end of the 19th century, it was called the Gilded Age. And there was an enormous gap between rich and poor in America, as there was in most countries at the time of the Industrial Revolution. That was the time. So that there was an enormous gap between the rich folks living on the Upper East Side of New York, the Rockefellers and the Fords and Carnegies and so on, who were unbelievably rich for the time, and barely 10 miles away, in the Lower East Side of New York, where the poor, huddled immigrant masses were living, many orders of magnitude different in the average income or wealth. Turns out it doesn't matter how you measure inequality. It's all the same story. So I'm not going to talk about measuring economic inequality. I know there's a lot of debate about that, but it doesn't matter at this level of description. There's this huge, big, upside-down U-curve. And you can see there, even as late as 1914, there was an enormous gap between the Upper East Side and the Lower East Side, and it was true across America. Then there was this reversal during the 20s when things got even worse. That's the period of the Roaring '20s, so the stock market was going up, and there was an anti-union movement, so there was a reversal, but then even before the onset of the Great Depression, that reversed, and you can see steadily from about 1927 or 28 until really the 60s, America got more and more equal. How equal? In the late 1950s, there were 2 countries in the world that were virtually tied for the level of economic equality. That is the small gap between rich and poor. One of those you would have guessed, that was socialist Sweden. Socialist Sweden had a very small gap between rich and poor Swedes, but they were tied with who? Capitalist America. In the late 1950s, America, when I was growing up, America was we were not a socialist country, but we had an amazingly equal distribution of income. Not perfect, of course. Sweden wasn't perfect, but I want you to see this was an enormously different America. I grew up in a very different America from my grandchildren. Because there, as you can see, sort of shortly after I went to college, that reversed. Now, I have to pause here for a moment about causation. It's possible that I personally caused the collapse of American civilization. But as good social scientists, let's entertain other hypotheses. Anyway, once Putnam is born, down, down, down. There's a little bit of a dip further when Reagan is elected, but it's not just a story about Reagan. And it looked here, this graph ends in the Obama years, and it looked like, oh, maybe we're finally done with that. But then Obama was succeeded by, can't remember who succeeded Obama, but and now the graph is down, as I said, below the bottom of the line. So, huge gap. Now I'm going to be even quicker. The next slide, sort of, if you know anything about social capital, I mean about bowling alone, this is, well, so up here is more social capital. So more people belong to groups, more people get married, more couples have kids, more people trust their neighbors, more people belong to organizations, the PTA and the Rotary Club, and yes, bowling leagues. That's what I mean by social capital, and they all show the same trend, so I'm not going to go too far into measurement details. As you can see, at the end of the 19th century, Americans, what was happening back then, there had just been the Industrial Revolution, and so millions of Americans had just moved in 1890 or 1900. Many, many Americans had just moved from the farm to the city, whether the farm was in Sicilia or Russia or Iowa, and they just moved to the cities, and they'd left all their family and friends and connections behind in the old country, and that's why we were so socially isolated at the turn of the century, turn of the becoming 20th century. But then, and now the graph becomes kind of familiar. You can see in the early years of the 20th century, people began to make new connections, they began to form new groups, they began to become somewhat more trusting of their neighbors, up, up, up. Again, you see the pause in the 20s, but then right up it goes, up to the, once again, you see there the Robert Putnam effect. Just as I'm leaving high school and in college, everybody trusts everybody else. Of course, it's the era of Putnam. But then I leave college and the country falls apart. And that's a straight line down. So now bowling alone, I don't want to fall off the stage, but now you can see where the book Bowling Alone fits into this much later book. It's the period, Bowling Alone said there was a decline in league bowling and so on from 1970 to 2000. And so what I now see is that I was missing most of the story in two senses. I had missed the whole century-long trend, even in bowling, even in social capital, and I had missed these other trends in inequality and polarization, and the last one we're going to get to in a second. Okay, let's go to the next slide. I wish I had had more time to talk about the measurements underneath this. The idea here is to what extent do Americans in any given year think of themselves as, yes, we're a we. We share an identity, or we don't. It's every man and woman for himself. You get that's a sort of a cultural variable. I'm really proud of the. Sorry, that's my wife. But we have high social capital, so I'm just going to turn her off, if I can figure out how to do that. I beg your pardon. We've been hanging out together for the last 62, 63 years, so a lot of social capital there. Thank you. Okay, buy the book, read the book. It's called The Upswing, and it's neat. It draws in part on some work, some incredibly interesting work that Gene pioneered about the first names of kids, but I'm going to let Gene explain that. It's not the only measure. So let's put all those slides together because they look pretty similar. Next slide. That's America. And that single graph summarizes, if you dig down underneath it, summarizes about 30 different seriously good econometric quality data on politics, economics, society, and culture. Summarizes it extremely elegantly, frankly. And that's what happened to America in this long I, we, I century. You see why I call it the I, we, I century. Okay, next slide. There's one other thing I want to say quickly. It's very important, but I just don't have time to go on in detail. The trend toward growing social isolation. Remember, we're starting this, this session is in large part about growing social isolation. Not only is that true for all Americans, it's especially true for middle class and working class Americans. In rough numbers, a third of Americans have a college education. Raise your hand if you're an American and you have a college education. You're all upper class, or even if you're working toward a college education, that puts you in the upper class, the upper third of America. And people like us, college-educated Americans, have also stopped having friends and stopped connecting with our neighbors, but not nearly as much as the 2/3 of our fellow citizens who don't have the benefit of a college education. Now, exactly why it's worse for them is a different question. It probably is education. It's probably not wealth, actually, but it doesn't matter. This basic trend is also splitting the country. Do you understand what I mean? It's not just that we're more socially isolated, it's that we're especially more socially isolated if you're not one of the chosen college-educated Americans. Let's have the next slide. So now I'm going to have a number of, we're done with the quantitative slides, but I'm going to try to summarize a number of important points. First of all, I think there are three fundamental crises of America's democratic crisis. I know this is not supposed to be a conference on America's democratic crisis. I thought you might just be interested in America's democratic crisis. It turns out to have some, what? You are, okay. So there are, I think, summarizing a lot of things, there are three fundamental causes. One is this shriveled sense of we. We've become an incredibly I-focused America. I mean, we're focused only on our own interests. And moreover, this social isolation is class-based. I've just so far just summarized what I've finished telling you. But also, this is not a split in America just about economics. And I know that this is, I love, some of my best friends are economists, but I have to say, and I know that many economists agree with this problem in America is not just about economics. It's a cultural. Educated progressives are looking down our noses at the 2/3 of our fellow citizens who don't have our privileges. And we shouldn't do that. Of course, morally we shouldn't do that, but mainly they know it. And they're pissed as hell. That's a technical term. I have good measures of how pissed they are at us, not just because we have more income and more privilege, but because we don't respect them. And so there's an economy of respect here that has to be taken into account. And some of you, if you follow American elections, will know that Hillary Clinton, who I actually worked for Hillary Clinton, personally worked for her in her campaign, but when she talked about these other folks, the people who were supporting Trump as the deplorables, she epitomized, that made it so much worse. You see, it made it so much worse because she said out loud what they anyhow thought. So, next slide. I'm trying to be quick here, guys. I wanted to go back to this slide. You've seen this before, but I want you to look at that. Now, what puzzles you about, what is the most interesting part of that graph? If you're like most people, you think up at the top, you think, well, what happened up there? Looks like the 1960s. What happened in the 1960s to make the American dream turn sour? That's not the most interesting, for us, that's not the most interesting period. Because the most interesting period is this period, because those folks were in a situation just like we are today, and they got out of it. So the question is, how did they do that? And this book that I've been drawing on here, called The Upswing, is called The Upswing because my co-author, Shannon Romney-Garrett, and I wanted to try to figure out how did they do that? And that turns out to be relevant to all of us here. It was a long way to get here, but I now want to be focusing on what lessons can we learn from those folks. let's have the next slide, please. We learned a number of things. First of all, if you see pendular moments like that in history, many people have been inclined to think that there's a sort of an underlying pendulum quite apart from human will, that, and that means if you just wait long enough, the things will get better. That's not what our story is or shows. History is not determined by somebody, by God or by the ownership of the means of production or any of those things. We determine our own history. We have agency. That's actually probably, in a way, the most important thing I want to say, especially to young people. Young people, I'm going to jump ahead quickly to say this to young people, some of whom are in the room. You didn't cause the problem. We caused this problem. But it's fallen to you to fix it, and you have agency. You can fix it because people over look at the first half of the first decades of the 20th century, people just like you did fix it then. So I'm not just saying, wouldn't it be nice if you could, get your act together. I'm saying all you have to do is do what they did. That's the first lesson. Secondly, next slide. No, the other one, other way, forward. Okay, now here's my attempt to lay out a to-do list. And Danny, you asked me to sort of lay out a to-do list. What should we do now, given what we know from that period? Are you with me? That's what I'm trying to get lessons from that period. I'm going to be quick here, but this is, in a sense, I'm trying to get to the whole point of this whole story. First of all, new forms of social capital have to be fun. It can't be civic broccoli. You can't say I tried saying this to some Dartmouth students out here, it's really important for you to do this because America depends upon it, and they walked away from me. Well, of course, it's got to be fun. That's the first thing. The second, and I'll say a word more about what that might look like. Secondly, the evidence is overwhelming. What I'm doing now is synthesizing the lessons from that last period when we did turn it around. You see, I'm sort of trying to say to you, I've spent years of my life looking at that period. It's called the Progressive Era, and asking, what did they do that was successful? And the second thing that's very important is mentoring matters. And they had a lot of different kinds of mentors in their lives. Coaches, like team coaches, were really important. Indeed, team sports, this you'll doubt, but I'll ask me a question in the question. Push me on this in question and answer, and I will show that I do know my stuff. Many team sports were invented in America for the purpose of fixing the problem. Raise your hand if you've ever heard of the strange American game called basketball. Basketball was invented in America in 1911 by a progressive clergyman who wanted to get kids inside, because you couldn't, it's all year long, inside with something that would be easy, wasn't complicated, did not require complicated hockey sticks, just required a round ball and a rim. That was a guy named James Naismith. He was an evangelical preacher. He was trying to fix the problem of youth disengagement, which we're trying to fix, and he invented basketball, and so on. Many other examples. Clergy were important mentors. Clergy are no longer so much in the lives of young people, and therefore they don't have, and Americans have priced team high school sports out of the reach of poor kids because it's terrible. It's the worst thing possible. When I grew up in Portland, I was a terrible awful football player. I was like 10th string. I only got on in the last minute of the game because the coach was feeling sorry for me. But, first of all, he was being sorry for me. That was his job, to worry about everybody. But secondly, the good taxpayers of Portland High School paid thousands of dollars for my helmet and my pads and my uniform and my spikes and the coach and the Friday night lights and the stadium. I didn't have to pay a thing. Now in Portland, if you want to play football just like I did, your parents have to pay $5,000. Well, if your annual income is $250,000, $5,000 is fine. You're just investing in your kids. If your annual income, as some of the people living in Portland, their annual income is now $20,000, it's outrageous. Okay, I've gone on too long. Other examples, I just have to add, here's another fact that you may or may not be surprised. In the period that I'm talking about, in the first, around 1910, lots of Americans recognized that there was a problem with young people, just as we are recognizing now. And what did they do? Well, in 5 years, most of the now existing youth-serving organizations were invented in 5 years. The Boy Scouts and the Girl Scouts and the Campfire Girls and boys clubs and girls clubs and Big Brother, Big Sister, and the 4-H. Okay, I've named, they were all invented in that small period. Why were they all invented? Because people recognized that kids needed mentors. I could go on. Another lesson is that new forms of social capital can be affected by spatial arrangements, by urban design and by physical design. Many examples, somebody talked about this yesterday, and I'm trying to say, yes, that's true. How many of you, do you all know what a playground is? Like with slides and swings and so on. How many of you know where playgrounds were invented? The first playground in the world was in Boston, Massachusetts in 1910. Yeah, by progressives. Why did they invent it? Because they thought space would encourage their kids to connect with other kids in a safe environment, get them off the streets. Okay, I keep saying I'm going to be quick, but maybe we can do it. We got a late start here. It was not our fault. The typefaces here are a little out. I want another big deal, and it came up yesterday, and I want to mention it very much, because it's relevant to all of you. Last time we in America did this, it required a social movement. In order to make the changes that people wanted to make, they had to get together and organize collectively to create, through a social mobilization process. Somebody yesterday, I'm sorry, I've forgotten his name, but the expert on attention, talked about unions. Absolutely right. Unions were one of the first organizations, maybe the first organization in America at the Progressive Era, who successfully organized large numbers of people. It was not always pretty, because some people got killed in that. I'm not trying to say this is all, you can't, if you're going to make a revolution, you've got to be prepared for some not quite nice things. And the other major social movement at that time was the suffragette movement, which won. The suffragette was the major organization, the major feminine organization. Of course, there were garden clubs and so on. That's when garden clubs too were invented, by the way. But it was the, I don't want to say hard-nosed, it was the firm demand of the suffragettes, first in England and then in America, who by organizing brought women the vote. And finally, and I'm going to get to this more in a second, the last of these second lessons is that new forms of social capital require changed norms and morality. And now we're going to get into the soft stuff, because I'm going to turn out to be arguing. I know that economists are uneasy about this. I'm going to be arguing that if we're going to fix the youth crisis in America today, we've got to begin paying attention also to norms and morality. Let's have the next slide, please. So here are the lessons. I really am close to the end here. I know it doesn't sound like it, but I am. And I'm out of breath. Here are 3 lessons from the last upswing, that same period. 1, go young. It turns out that the best revolutionaries are young people. Old people like me are important to a revolution because we say it doesn't have to be like this. And that's what I'm saying to you right now. I know that Americans don't have to be very unequal. I lived in an America in which we were as equal as the Swedes. I know that we don't have to be fighting one another, because I lived in an America in which most bills were passed by bipartisan majorities in Congress. I know that we don't have to be so socially isolated, because I grew up and played in a bowling league with 5 people on my team. If you want to see my junior high school bowling league, look at the back cover of the hardbound edition of Bowling Alone, and you will see a tall, skinny guy who's 12 in the middle, and 4 other guys, 2 whites and 2 blacks. Notice that. I'm talking about middle America in the 1950s in bowling leagues. Bowling leagues among kids were integrated. So I do know what it was like, but I can't figure out, it's up to my grandchildren and some of you, My grandchildren are now mostly in their mid-20s. They're the ones who are going to know what forms of social capital will work best in 2050 or 2060. I'm long gone. So it has to be young people. And it was. Almost all the social reformers, serious social reformers, the progressive era, were under 30. Many of them were under 20. So it's not just that we're trying to do this for young people. It's got to be done by young people. They've got to have agency. Okay, I'm going to get carried away. And finally, go moral. And what I mean by that, it turns out there's a lot. You saw all those graphs. There's a lot of econometrics there. You could look and see, well, what was a leading indicator and what was a lagging indicator? That might give you some clue as to what you should do now, what we should do now. Do you know what I mean by leading indicator and lagging indicator? I mean, which turned in the right direction first? I thought, because all Americans are at base materialists, I thought, well, the economics variable must be driving everything else. Wrong. It's very clear that the economic equality was a lagging variable. So what turned first? Morality, the sense of who we are. And I wish I could take time, we're way over time here. I wish I could take time now to tell you what that meant. But what it meant was, this is 2 sentences, America's public philosophy in the 1870s was something called social Darwinism. It was a knockoff of Darwin. Darwin, by the way, was not a social Darwinist, but some really awful racist people were, and they said if it's good enough for the iguanas, it's good enough for us, and therefore, if people have been successful, it's because they have better genes, right? This is where eugenicism comes from. And therefore, this is the public policy implication. I am not joking. This was what large numbers of American political and ordinary people thought. We should tax poor people who have poor genes and give the results to rich people who obviously have better genes. That was, I just won't say anything else about it. It's hard to believe anybody seriously held that view, moral view, but they did. But that was soon replaced by what was called social evangelism and the social gospel. And the social gospel said, read the damned Sermon on the Mount. I'm sorry, that's probably not what Jesus said.
Well, we've got to stop. We've got to move to the other. We've got to give him a separate. It was fantastic.
But I'm going to tell you I just want to tell you one more parable. So it's 1911, spring of 1911. Stick with me just for a second. On the lower, in lower Manhattan, just off Washington Square, on one side of the square, a young debutante was having tea with her friends. She was planning to get married to a rich banker because that part of lower Manhattan faces Wall Street. But she and her visitors, I'm going to just keep going with this story.
No, we got to get the others, Bob. This is wonderful, but I haven't got time.
We got a late start, Manny, and I'm going to finish the darn sentence, the darn story. Quickly. These people on the east side of New York heard a commotion on the other side. They heard fire trucks. And they went outside and saw a big tenement factory building burning. It was called the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, with large numbers of young people, young women, locked by the owner of the company in their rooms, unable to get out, and therefore jumping to their death. Scores of young people coming. I've been there. The building is gone, but there's a memorial now. You can, dozens of young people jumping down to their death. And this woman on the other side of the square had an immoral epiphany. She said, I can't live with this. I mean, this is what is required. She had a moral epiphany and said, this can't stand. Her name was Frances Perkins. This is going to be really quick. Eventually, Frances Perkins got involved in local politics and in national politics. She was the first American cabinet secretary. She wrote the Social Security Act. She wrote unemployment insurance in America. She wrote the first act giving kids benefits. And that was because of a combination of A, moral outrage, B, local engagement, and 3, she was young. That's what young people today should do. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Bob. All right. It is such an honor to be here and to hear Bob Putnam speak. For me, you want your notes? I would have been happy to give you all the rest of the time. So I am I believe, token social psychologist on the panel. So I'm just going to give 3 quick reactions to some of this data and these points. So one, Alex Bryson, who's next after me, and I were talking about this last night, of that what you see in Bob's graphs is that curve, right? And in mental health, the graphs you saw yesterday were a little different. We don't have mental health data, especially from one study that goes back that far. So I can't show you my own graph on this, but we can piece it together from other sources. And we see, very similar to what you saw there, that 1950s, early 1960s, if you start there looking at the mental health, say, of young people, it gets progressively worse over that time when social capital was falling. And I think that had a lot to do with it. So about from the 1950s to around 1993 or so, it's pretty uniform. You see that picture. Then there's this period from about 1993 to about 2011 where some of the mental health indicators were stable. A few were getting worse. There were some that were actually getting markedly better. So teen suicide went down over that time. Teen depression in some data sets went down over that time. Well, there were a few things social capital-wise that happened, around that time. One is violent crime peaked and then resolved. Teen pregnancy started to go down around that time. There was something else that happened in the early 90s, though, which was Prozac. So SSRI antidepressants may have had something to do with that. But then 2012, once you get social media, smartphones, and so on, that recovery was over. And then it all got worse again. So I think that's good to put in context. So the other piece I think is important to mention is that political polarization. So as Bob was saying, he's got his graphs up until 2015 with political polarization. And I think we all know it has gotten a lot worse since then. Why? Well, there's lots of reasons, but social media is, again, a key piece of that picture because it puts us in silos, so we get the information that we want to hear. It used to be, in that era that Bob was talking about at the top of that curve, that you saw the evening news for half an hour on 3 networks, and then you had a newspaper. So people were getting more or less the same information. And then you got cable TV, and then you got social media, and things became much more atomized. Plus, social psychology research, really amazing, has dug into this in detail and found, do you know what spreads the most on social media? Things that make people upset and angry. That's what gets likes, that's what gets shared. So what you're seeing on social media is a funhouse mirror. And so that is going to have effects on democracy. The last piece is the social class piece. So you saw, as Bob showed, that decline in social interaction is larger among those without a college degree. So I'm going to do Bob's trick here of how many of you have heard of, but I'm not going to get as many hands. There might be a few. How many of you have heard of the Case and Deaton paper from 2015 about mortality for classes? A few. Okay. So they showed that for the first time in a long time, mortality among middle-aged Americans, especially white Americans, was increasing. That's now actually spread across race and ethnicity if you look at the data. And that was particularly pronounced for those without a college degree. So I thought that was intriguing. That social isolation very well may have something to do with that increased mortality. But as a psychologist, I was curious, well, does that extend to mental health? So as you saw yesterday, among adults, there's not much of a change in depression, but there is a change in happiness among adults. And it started around 2000 when happiness among adults started to decline in the US. But there's a trick to that. This is where I do wish I had one graph, but I'll walk you through it. It looks a lot like that graph that Bob was showing you on social isolation, and it looks a lot like some of the graphs that Case and Deaton have, where among college-educated Americans, there hasn't been much change. So there hasn't been as much change in social interaction, there hasn't been as much change in the mortality rate of middle-aged Americans, and there hasn't been much change in the level of happiness. But then you look at those without a college degree, or who have, say, less income. It doesn't even matter which socioeconomic measure you use. That's where you see it. So for the college-educated higher income, it's flat. And for those without a college degree, happiness is down. And when I saw that, I thought that explains Trump. That's exactly what Bob was talking about, that there's not just a division in terms of income that has increased, not just a division as Case and Deaton found in physical health and mortality, but also in happiness. So there is a happiness gap by class that has grown tremendously. In that top of the peak era that Bob was talking about, in the 1950s, 1960s, in this case, we got data starting even in the 70s, the happiness of people with and without a college degree was barely there. They were very close together, and now they're very, very far apart. And I think that explains a lot about what's going on with democracy and with the country today. Thank you. Yeah.
First of all, I want to thank the organizers of this symposium for inviting me. The symposium is about a psychological issue, but I am an economist. In my work, I often found disciplinary barriers. So I really thank the UNDP, the college, and in particular, Danny Blanchflower. The topic today, my topic today, is about whether social media harms the mental health of the young. I will follow quite closely the slides so I can be more concise, clearer, and also because my English is a little bit rusty. A much-cited article thus concludes that there is no evidence that using social media is driving an epidemic of mental illness. This article is based on reviews here listed. Unfortunately, in all the reviews listed, there are no economic research referenced. In each item of the list, there are no reference to economic research. Secondly, in a more recent, voluminous and authoritative report, which is based on 200 studies, no reference to economic research is included. This is an unfortunate neglect because the mentioned reviews share the common conclusions that most studies use correlations and that this method has led to insignificant or irrelevant results, so that the causal analysis needed is advocated, actually. The irony is that economics research exactly focuses on causal analysis, and it adopts a peculiar method very appreciated by the economists called quasi-experiment, and finds that social media cause poor mental health in the young. Moreover, it provides some evidence to explain why. Everybody knows that correlation is not causation, as this is the case in the relationship between social media use and poor mental health. The reason is that direction of causality is ambiguous. in the quasi-experimental method, causation is organized by replacing social media use by social media access, thanks to infrastructure, technology that made available this access. Causation is strong if three requirements are met. First, social media access is significantly linked to social media use. Secondly, social media access is not influenced by variables that influence poor mental health. Thirdly, social media access does not influence poor mental health through other variables. Social media access means that social media is available at home. It is often captured by high-speed internet access thanks to broadband, optical fiber, 3G, and so on. Of course, evidence must be shown with the association with social media use. The last two requirements are usually met by arguing that the access providers follow the conformation of the territory and the history of the telecommunication infrastructure, thus making the variables quasi-random. By testing the independence of social media access from income, and by using instruments that make distance, that takes distance from home to the service provider actually as a random instrument. The quasi-experiment, the estimation used is a difference in difference design. It takes comparisons between two groups, the treated group, which has the access at T1, and the other group called control group, which has no access at T1. This is because the access is staggered over time and over a territory. And many variables are used to make the two groups more similar as possible, except that the treated group has the access as T1. The advantages beyond better identifying causality is that social media access has not the bias of subjective data. The results have external validity, more validity than the experiment in the lab. Big samples can be used quite easily because they are available, so we can have stronger results. And delayed samples, that is, we can look at on time very delayed, not weeks, but months or years. The problem is meeting the three requirements, which is not so easy. And in the treated group, we can find non-users. But this is not a complete problem, because in this case, we can observe that non-users' mental health may be affected by users' mental health. But in some cases, we have individual data, so this problem can be overcome. These are the 9 studies I found. These 2 studies in Netherlands, in the United States. In the first study, we go back to the introduction to Facebook in 2004, 2006, and we can compare colleges with Facebook to colleges without it. And in a second case, you can compare, in the second case, we look at the introduction of the algorithm that personalizes content delivery, and we can compare individuals, we have individual data, individuals with Instagram account with individuals without it. The samples are big in both cases. In the second case, a variant is to exclude the pandemic years. And the Poor Mental Health Index combines many relevant questions on depression, anxiety, depression services, even up to 2.5 years later. And a very similar index is used in the case of Netherlands. And the result is that the effect is a worsening of poor mental health. But in the American case, the group is rather limited, and it captures the interaction within the group. So we can find a rather limited impact of 10% more. Instead, in the second case, we have a very widespread interaction, and the impact is very big, 4 times bigger. It is estimated that it is close to the worsening of poor mental health as losing a job. Here we have 2 studies that use high-speed internet access, and the particularity of these studies is that they use diagnosis in hospitals, so we have more objective data, and for severe mental health, so the estimation is an underestimation. In the first case, we have a worsening of 20% more of diagnosis in youth, and in the second case, 4.2, and especially on girls. Here we have 3 studies. As you see, in each study is about a different country. Each study uses a different data on infrastructure, technological infrastructure for providing broadband, wireless, 3G, and others. And in each study, there are slightly different sample of people or of children. For example, in the second case, we have exactly children. In every study, we see that poor mental health is slightly differently defined, but the impact is always the same, a worsening of poor mental health, and especially in girls. Here we have 2 studies about less advanced countries. In the first study, the data is about both fixed and mobile broadband. The sample is big, concentrated on young people, and the impact is significant and sizable. In the second case, however, the data are restricted only to the fixed band broadband provider. And this is sensible because we are in an age rather recent, and it is restricted to the urban areas only. And in fact, we find no significance in the results, in the final result. Just significant in a right item that is worry, to being worried. What explanation is suggested by this type of study? The suggested explanation is that social media use tends to crowd out youth's everyday experiences that are beneficial to their long-term development, and a new type of addiction can thus arise. What are crowded out? This is the list. And the list found by the studies that use the quasi-experimental method. These are not moderators in correlation, but they are effective caused by social media use. And a list that include schoolwork, study time and learning, academic attention, sleep, self-esteem. And the second group, socialization time in girls, connections with friends, participation in organizations. Crowding out this list means weaken the development of human capital, which is future-oriented. And the second group means weaken the development of social capital, which is others-oriented. Then we can depict an alternative addiction in which social media use crowds out these future and others-oriented experiences. This weaken human and social capital, thus linking what Bob Putnam said. And this makes young people vulnerable to life's challenges, thus paving the way to poor mental health. But in this position, they obviously prefer the expected immediate rewards of social media use as a self-medication, rather than the expected uncertain rewards, which is costly in terms of self-commitment, of effort. Then we can close the circle of causation, which is alternative with the traditional one, which is the higher, the more intensive social media use, the higher is the expected immediate rewards, and vice versa. The higher the expected immediate rewards, the more I use social media through the dopaminergic system. These are the policy implications, very general. More specifically, Bob Putnam said very good things I completely agree with. Policy becomes more effective. It also adopts population-based approach with a lot of advantages. First, considering social externalities, better investigating what shapes preferences and motivations, informing policymakers about the necessary scale and fields of action, addresses the policy becomes more effective. It also addresses the new type of addiction that comes through the weakened development of human and social capital. Policy can help young people use social media rather than being used by social media. Thanks a lot for your time.
Hi, everyone. Now, it would be stupid of me, wouldn't it, to get up here and disagree with these guys? Everything they've said seems eminently plausible, but I'm going to point to a really big fact that's been overlooked here and has been overlooked by perhaps all of us until we wrote the last of our 20 papers, more or less, for Pedro. All the action in the decline of young people's well-being in the United States is linked to paid work. Those are the people in employment who've taken the hit. Much less so for those out of employment. This is a really big surprise. Anybody who does psychology or economics knows that there's a very profound relationship between paid work and well-being. Those who are in work are much happier, they're much less prone to depression and anxiety. This could be related to everything that Bob has been talking about. Those people are connected to each other, they're connected to the world to the extent that they got a job and held on to that job in the first place. Why then do we see these numbers? This was briefly touched upon by Danny earlier on. What it shows is the percentage of workers only in this chart. Looking across the x-axis, you see the age of individuals, and you see the incidence of despair. Remember how many of the last 30 days were bad mental health days. And you see the elevation over time such that we go from the early in the period 2 to 3% of workers. By the end of the period, we see something like 8-9% of workers saying every day in the last 30 days was a bad mental health day. Fine, really interesting, unbelievable. This is even more unbelievable. Because guess what? The hump shape in ill-being, it still exists. Let's say it. Danny was wrong to some extent. It only exists, however, for people who are not in paid work. This is the United States here. This is the best data we got. The BRFSS from the Centers for Disease Prevention. Really amazing stuff. I've split it into 2 periods, an early period and a late period. What you see is the elevation in ill-being, in despair amongst workers. You can see it here, but there's not a lot happening in the hump shape of ill-being by age for those who are not in paid work. This is really important for young people in this country because about 60% of them are in paid employment, yeah? So when you decompose the change in ill health, mental ill health of young people in this country, is predominantly related to what's happening to people who are in paid work. Question, how does that relate to Bob? How does that relate to Jean? How does that relate to Maurizio? Not entirely clear. What we should be doing is spending much more time thinking about what happens to people who have made it into paid employment. And this, I think, is potentially a technology story again, because we heard about the fissuring of our consciousness yesterday. Profit-maximizing firms don't need to de-skill workers through new technologies, but that's what they are doing. And they are using the decline in the costliness of monitoring worker effort. They're using new technologies to do this. They're also using new technologies to, in a very precise way, link changes in the demand for your labor to the supply of that labor through gig working, through these algorithms. Who's most exposed to that gig work? Young people. Now, this is an hypothesis of mine. Nobody's ever tested this, to my knowledge. It would be very hard to do in the United States because guess what? You ain't got the data. Probably Andrew, he's not going to talk about it in his talk. Andrew's from France. They probably do have the data because what you need is you don't just need where are you, working, not working. You also need how you feel and what you're exposed to in your workplace, which is data that comes from employers, linked employer-employee data that's longitudinal, which has subjective well-being data in it. Very high bar, yeah? Very high bar. You don't have it in the US. So that's a big, big plan of work for social scientists in this country. Thank you.
Danny? So you're in charge of the timing. We were given 10 minutes less than we had been promised.
I want to go for 5 more minutes. We can go. Questions, people, maybe. Up here.
Well, thank you for your wonderful presentations. I have a question about countries in which, or democratic countries that have compulsory governmental service, not necessarily military service, but some other service to their country. is there any data that might show whether or not there's a relationship between compulsory service and social capital and or mental health? And what might those data show? And what, if they do show a positive relationship, what implications might there be for other countries that don't have such service?
Do any of you know anything about that? Okay, I know a little bit about that. But what I don't know is exactly the question you asked, which is other countries that have compulsory service. It's, the fact that it's compulsory is really important to this study. There is actually quite good data on the effects of non-compulsory service in America, which is what you would think. Volunteering to do civic good deeds as young people does have a strong and enduring effect in the right direction. That is to say, you continue throughout life to be more effective. That was true for the earliest data on that was in the Peace Corps, but then there's been a lot of studies since. There's, of course, a possible selection effect there, so that's what's hard to pin apart. The best data on compulsory service actually is with World War II, when we had a draft. That was the last time we had a draft. And there, although it's really old data, or at least it's data about experiences that happened a long time ago, there is actually pretty good data that if you served in the US military between 1941 and 1945, which is when we were in the war, many years later, I mean like 50 years later, you were a better citizen. That's the strongest data that I know in the US. And I personally am actually quite involved in the national service movement to try to get. The last thing I have to say is it's politically very hard to do. Why? Because young people hate compulsory service. They think of it as a you know, we who are also not very civic are trying to impose it on them because it would be good, you know, for the whole country. So I don't know that it's going to happen, but especially compulsory service, I don't know if it's going to happen. It'd be nice from a methodological point of view if we could do it some places and not others. That's a short answer to the question. I'm very sympathetic to the idea, but except for the World War II draftees, we don't have any actually really hard data.
Got time for one more question. I've seen the lady over there. Microphone's coming. Mic's coming.
I don't think I need the microphone.
Yes, do, please, because they have to hear you.
Got it, thank you. Bob, the slides you showed, the 4 different factors, which of those do you think are causal and which are correlated?
Yeah, it's hard. It's actually, if you really unpeel it, which I won't take time to do now, there's a ton of feedback. Inequality makes, inequality increases polarization. Polarization reduces the ability of the government to affect inequality, and so on. I mean, it's a spaghetti of loops, feedback loops. But the one that is the most striking to me and that I did not expect is this feeling of moral obligation about other people. It's the core, I've come to think, is that it's very simple. It's not even all that religious. It's just be nice to other people. For people and for times when large numbers of people believe that they have obligations to other people. It's very simple. It's nothing theological, actually. Those people make political choices that then lead to all the other good things. Does that make sense? I mean, in other words, the sort of causal story is, for some reason, at some times, some people become convinced that they have obligations to other people. They choose political leaders who produce policies that reduce inequality or help inequality. So I think it's a quite plausible story, but I mean, actually getting serious econometric stuff, I tried really hard, is very difficult. Because of the different lags, you can make almost anything the cause if you assume certain lags. It's a really excellent question. That's the best I can do. At least I want to say this way. Anybody even people who care about econometric data, should not dismiss the possibility that upstream of it all is a moral conviction that we have obligations to other people. Now, how to get that is actually, national service is one of the reasons it's plausible story, plausible policy, is that it might convince us, or the people who go through it, that they have obligations to other people.
Wow, we love them all. Thank you so much. See you. Thank you. We have another one coming. Thank you so much, everybody. Brilliant, and we love Bob. He's the best. He's my mentor and friend, and he's mad at me, but it's okay.
I'm not mad. No. We were promised 10 more minutes.
We're good. We're good. I've got you 10 more minutes. Let's go. Thank you. Got a couple of minutes, and then we'll...